In the tobacco fields of Colonial Maryland, beneath the rolling hills of Anne Arundel County, lies a secret so disturbing that the Catholic Church has spent over 2 centuries trying to wipe it from existence. Between 1734 and 1768, 12 parishes across the colony fell under the grip of a single family, a name so feared that even today, elderly parishioners cross themselves at its mention. The Thornton family didn't just serve God, they played him, twisting the sacred rite of confession into a tool of terror, building an empire so ruthless it would make modern organized crime look quaint by comparison. What you're about to hear has been pieced together from sealed church archives, coded journals hidden inside the walls of a Maryland farmhouse until their discovery in 1892, and testimonies buried for nearly 3 centuries. This isn't just another tale of religious corruption, it's the story of how 3 men turned the confessional booth into a throne of blackmail, poison, and the most grotesque abuse of sacred trust ever recorded in American history. Before we dive deeper into the Thornton family's reign of ecclesiastical terror, I have to ask, are you ready for this? This channel isn't for everyone, only for the rare souls willing to stare into the darkness that history tried to bury. If you're one of them, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Are you brave enough to share your city as we descend into this nightmare together? Now, back to Maryland, 1734. When evil wore a priest's collar. That autumn, Colonial Maryland stood on a knife's edge, caught between Protestant and Catholic tensions. It was a religious battleground where the Calvert family's Catholic power still held sway, even as Anglican influence crept ever closer. In this volatile climate, the tiny port town of Havenwood, tucked along the Severn River about 20 miles southeast of Annapolis, embodied everything the Thornton family needed to thrive. The Catholic Church was fighting to preserve its foothold in the New World. Havenwood was not large by colonial standards, perhaps 800 souls scattered among tobacco plantations and the modest businesses that sustained them. But what the town lacked in size, it made up for in influence. Havenwood's Catholic families controlled much of the tobacco trade that coursed through the Chesapeake Bay, their names appearing on shipping manifests bound for London and the Caribbean alike. The Curthers owned 3 plantations and a fleet of merchant ships. The Whitmore family operated the largest tobacco warehouse between Baltimore and Annapolis. The Ashfords built their fortune on tobacco as well, and on the quieter, but no less lucrative, slave trade. At the heart of this Catholic enclave stood St. Bartholomew's Church, a humble brick structure whose bell tower was visible to ships entering the Severn River. Unlike the grand cathedrals of Europe, St. Bartholomew's reflected the practical sensibilities of colonial architecture, sturdy oak pews, plain glass windows, and thick walls that could endure Maryland's sweltering summers and the occasional pirate trade that still plagued the Chesapeake. Yet it was what lay within those walls that would make St. Bartholomew's infamous. In the late summer of 1734, Father Thomas Thornton arrived as the new parish priest, bringing with him an unusual request. He wished to install new confessional booths, not 1 or 2, but 4 elaborately crafted wooden chambers he claimed would better serve the spiritual needs of his growing flock. Father Thornton was not the sort of priest most parishioners expected. Tall and imposing at nearly 6 feet, with prematurely gray hair and piercing blue eyes, he possessed an intelligence that felt almost predatory. He spoke with the polished accent of a man educated in Europe's finest seminaries, yet his demeanor hinted at a deeper understanding of the harsh realities of colonial life, a knowledge uncommon among men of the cloth. When he smiled, as he often did in those first months, the gesture never quite reached his eyes. What the parishioners of St. Bartholomew's never suspected was that Father Thornton had spent the past 5 years crisscrossing Maryland's Catholic parishes, quietly compiling dossiers on their wealthiest and most influential members. He studied their business ventures, traced their family ties, noted their strengths, and, most importantly, uncovered their hidden weaknesses. He hadn't come to Havenwood to save souls. He had come to harvest secrets. The confessional booths he installed were masterpieces of subtle deception, crafted by his nephew Marcus, a talented carpenter who claimed to have honed his trade in Philadelphia. To the eye, They were standard three-chamber confessionals, a central compartment for the priest, flanked by two kneeling stalls for the penitent. The dark oak panels and intricately carved crosses lent them an air of solemn sanctity that reassured even the wealthiest worshippers. But hidden within the polished walls was an innovation that would have scandalized the faithful had they ever discovered it. Marcus Thornton had built a network of hollow tin tubes, cunningly concealed inside the woodwork, that ran from each penitent's stall down to a secret chamber beneath the church. Angled just right, these tubes carried every whispered confession without distortion to the basement below. The recording system was deceptively simple. The tubes ended in echo chambers lined with curved metal to amplify the sound. A listener hidden below could hear every word spoken above with unsettling clarity. Yet Father Thornton's treachery didn't end there. He trained his younger nephew, Samuel, to transcribe the confessions by hand, encoding each one with a cipher of his own invention, an archive of guilt and sin, locked away in the church's cold stone undercroft. The first victim of the Thornton family's scheme revealed himself on a bitter February morning in 1735, though he would die never knowing it. He was walking straight into a trap 6 months in the making. Richard Whitmore stepped through the doors of St. Bartholomew that Tuesday morning carrying a burden that had been gnawing at him for weeks. As one of Havenwood's most prosperous tobacco merchants, Whitmore was known throughout the colony for his unwavering devotion to Catholic doctrine and his generous contributions to the church. His reputation rested on integrity, fair dealing, and a moral rectitude that made other merchants eager to do business with him. But Richard Whitmore harbored a secret that could shatter everything he had built. 3 months earlier, during a business trip to Annapolis, Whitmore had met a young woman named Catherine Mills, an indentured servant working at the tavern where he often stayed. Catherine was 19, strikingly beautiful in a way that made men forget their vows, and bound to a contract with 4 years yet to serve. What began as innocent conversation soon turned to something far more damning: adultery, a sin his faith condemned as among the gravest. Now, kneeling in the confessional that February morning, Whitmore whispered his guilt to Father Thornton. He confessed his shame, his betrayal of his wife Margaret, and his violation of his sacred vows. He spoke of his continuing affair with Catherine, his plans to buy out her indenture, and his dread that the scandal would ruin his family's name. Father Thornton listened with the practiced compassion of a seasoned confessor, offering gentle reassurances that God's mercy was open to any soul who truly repented. He prescribed prayers and charitable acts as penance, then blessed Whitmore, who left the confessional with tears of relief streaming down his cheeks. But in the basement below St. Bartholomew, Samuel Thornton carefully transcribed every word of Whitmore's confession, encoding it in the cipher his uncle had taught him. The young man's handwriting was meticulous as he recorded details that would soon become weapons. Catherine Mills, indentured servant at the Brass Lantern Tavern in Annapolis. Contract holder, Jonathan Pierce. Relationship ongoing since November 1734. Whitmore plans to purchase indenture within the month. The transformation of this sacred confession into a tool for blackmail began exactly 1 week later. Father Thornton requested a private audience with Whitmore, claiming an urgent spiritual matter required discussion. They met in the priest's study on a Thursday evening, the chamber lit only by flickering candlelight that cast restless shadows across shelves lined with heavy theological tomes. "Richard," Father Thornton began, his voice warm, almost fatherly, "I've been praying deeply about our conversation last week. God has revealed to me a path forward, one that might ease your burden." Whitmore leaned in, hope flickering across his face, hope that his spiritual advisor might offer him redemption. "The church faces significant expenses in the coming months," Father Thornton continued smoothly. "We plan to expand our charitable works, perhaps even establish a fund to assist indentured servants in dire circumstances. Young women especially, those who find themselves particularly vulnerable." He paused, letting the implication hang in the candlelit air. Then he pressed on. "I believe God is calling you to make a substantial contribution to this new fund, perhaps £50 to begin with, followed by monthly donations of £10. It would be a testament to the sincerity of your repentance and would help others who might share Miss Mills's plight. The color drained from Whitmore's face as the truth settled in. Father Thornton had not only remembered every detail of his confession but was now wielding that sacred trust as leverage for money. Yet the priest's kindly expression never faltered. Beneath it, though, Whitmore saw the glint of something cold and calculating in those pale blue eyes. "Father, our conversation was under the seal of confession." "And it remained so," Father Thornton interjected smoothly. "I would never violate that sacred trust. But God speaks to me in many ways, Richard, sometimes through prayer, sometimes through revelation. He had revealed to me your wish to assist young Catherine, and I am simply offering you a sanctified means to channel that charitable impulse." Whitmore sat in stunned silence, his merchant's mind racing to tally the cost. £50 up front was a substantial sum, but manageable. £10 each month thereafter would be more difficult, yet not impossible. The alternative, having his indiscretion exposed, would ruin his marriage, devastate his business partnerships, and shatter his standing in the community. "And if I were to contribute to this charitable fund," Whitmore ventured cautiously, "then I trust the Lord would bless you with the discretion to guard all my personal affairs?" Father Thornton's smile was thin and cold. "The Church," he replied, "has always been a sanctuary for those who seek to live righteous lives, safe from the wagging tongues of gossips and the meddling of busybodies." And so Whitmore agreed to the payments, convincing himself he was performing an act of mercy that might rescue other young women from hardship. He had no inkling that he was the first of what would become hundreds of victims, nor that his private confession had served as the test case for a blackmail scheme that would soon spread through Maryland like a plague. That night, as Whitmore made his way home through the silent streets of Havenwood, a chill crept over him that had nothing to do with the bitter February wind. He felt, with an unshakable dread, that his life had shifted irrevocably, that he had stepped across an unseen threshold from which he could never return. Behind him, the bell tower of St. Bartholomew's rose into the star-pricked sky like a black finger pointing not to heaven, but perhaps to somewhere far darker. The success of the Whitmore extortion convinced Father Thornton that his method was not only feasible but far more profitable than he had ever imagined. In the months that followed, he set about enacting the second phase of his plan, a systematic expansion that would transform the religious landscape of Colonial Maryland into his own clandestine empire. The key to this dark expansion lay with Father Thornton's two nephews. Marcus, the elder at 28, possessed the technical prowess to build the specially modified confessionals. Samuel, barely 21, had been schooled since boyhood in the art of transcription and coded record-keeping. But what made them truly dangerous was, what made the Thornton scheme truly diabolical was that both young men were, in fact, legitimate priests. They had completed their seminary education in Baltimore under the careful guidance, and generous financial backing, of their uncle, Father Thornton himself. By the spring of 1735, Father Thornton had secured new appointments for his nephews at 2 additional parishes. Marcus was assigned to St. Michael's in the busy port town of Easton, while Samuel took over the struggling parish of St. Joseph's in the tobacco-growing region near Chestertown. Each new post came with the same innocuous request, permission to install new confessional booths, ostensibly to better serve their growing flocks. Their expansion strategy was both methodical and patient. Rather than attempting to blackmail every parishioner who whispered a secret behind the screen, the Thorntons focused only on what they called productive sins, transgressions committed by those wealthy enough to pay handsomely and with reputations so delicate that exposure would be ruinous. Adultery was ideal, but they also sought out embezzlement, tax evasion, illicit business deals, and the various corrupt dealings that thrived in colonial commerce. Their system of communication was as sophisticated as their confessional modifications. Through a discreet network of merchant contacts and itinerant salesmen, the three priests kept up a steady stream of coded letters. On the surface, these missives discussed mundane church matters, but hidden within were detailed reports on potential victims and their secrets. A letter describing a spiritual awakening among tobacco farmers might in truth be a report that several plantation owners had confessed to tax fraud. A request for extra prayer books for the Women's Society could, in fact, be coded instructions identifying which wealthy widow had admitted to an affair with her overseer. By the end of 1735, the Thornton network was reaping a steady profit from 12 regular victims spread across their 3 parishes. Richard Whitmore remained their most reliable source of income. His monthly payments had risen to £15 under the pretense that the church's charitable needs were growing. Yet the Whitmore case taught the Thorntons an invaluable lesson about manipulating their victims' psychology. Instead of bluntly demanding hush money, Father Thornton developed a far more cunning system. He provided each victim with a moral justification for their payments. In this way, the victims could cling to their dignity and believe they were giving charitably to the church, even as they fed the Thorntons' unholy enterprise. The money was always presented as charitable donations, penance payments, or contributions to specific church projects. Victims were encouraged to see themselves not as targets of blackmail, but as generous benefactors, a psychological manipulation that minimized the risk of rebellion or desperate measures. The effectiveness of this system was most evident in the case of Edmund Curthers, a wealthy plantation owner whose shipping business dominated trade across the Chesapeake Bay. Curthers had privately confessed to systematically underreporting his cargo manifests to avoid paying the full customs duties owed to the Crown, a practice that, though widespread, was technically treasonous and could result in the seizure of his entire estate. When Father Thornton approached Curthers about making a substantial donation to support the church's mission among the poor, the plantation owner at first resisted. But the priest's gentle reminder that God sees all our commercial dealings, even those hidden in the shadows of the customs house, was enough to win Curthers' compliance. Within 6 months, he was contributing £25 each month to what he believed was a fund for impoverished Catholic families in Maryland. As time passed, the psychological toll on the victims became unmistakable. Richard Whitmore, once renowned for his jovial nature and social ease, grew increasingly withdrawn and anxious. He began attending Mass daily instead of weekly, as if excessive piety might somehow tip the scales of his guilt back into balance. His wife, Margaret, noticed the change but attributed it to business stress and her husband's deepening religious devotion. Edmund Curthers manifested different symptoms. Always a meticulous record-keeper, he grew obsessively fixated on his business ledgers, spending hours each night reviewing shipping manifests and correspondence as if searching for some overlooked error. His slaves reported that he would often wake in the middle of the night to personally inspect cargo that had already been checked multiple times. But the most disturbing transformation unfolded within the parishes themselves. The Thornton priests had cultivated an atmosphere of spiritual fervor that edged dangerously close to fanaticism. Their sermons relentlessly hammered on themes of hidden sin, divine retribution, and the absolute necessity of total honesty before God. Parishioners were urged to confess frequently, sometimes warned that going more than a week without unburdening their souls put them at risk of eternal damnation. This relentless spiritual pressure created a feedback loop that fed directly into the Thorntons' blackmail scheme. Terrified of harboring unconfessed sins, parishioners began revealing not only their gravest transgressions but also trivial misdeeds, fleeting immoral thoughts, and questionable business dealings. Over time, the Thorntons' confession records swelled into a rich archive of secrets, effectively a private dossier on the hidden lives of Colonial Maryland's elite. Such a trove of information would be a priceless asset to any criminal enterprise. By early 1736, Father Thornton was ready to execute the third phase of his scheme, an ambitious expansion that would extend his network throughout Maryland and potentially into neighboring colonies. He had already earmarked 16 additional parishes for infiltration and begun recruiting trusted family members and loyal associates to manage the growing confession recording operation. But this expansion plan faced a critical obstacle. The Catholic hierarchy in Baltimore had begun to notice the peculiar construction projects overseen by the Thornton priests. Bishop Carroll, in particular, questioned why relatively small parishes required such elaborate confessional installations, and rumors swirled that he was preparing to order formal inspections of churches fitted with these new confessionals. The solution Father Thornton devised would become both his crowning achievement and the seed of his downfall. It required a depth of corruption so profound that it would ultimately shake the very foundations of Catholic authority in colonial Maryland, and force the Thorntons across a moral boundary from which there was no return. In the winter of 1736, an unexpected crisis struck, one that would test the resilience of the Thornton network and reveal the true extent of their criminal ambitions. Isabella Ashford, the 19-year-old daughter of one of Havenwood's most prominent Catholic families, began to suspect that something was deeply wrong with the confession she was offering at St. Bartholomew. Isabella, possessed of a sharp intelligence that colonial society tried, and failed, to stifle in women, had been privately tutored to fluency in French and Latin. Her extensive reading of her father's religious library had fostered a deep, almost scholarly, interest in Catholic theology. This education would become Father Thornton's first grave miscalculation. The previous autumn, Isabella had confessed reading books deemed unsuitable for an unmarried woman, specifically, philosophical treatises that questioned traditional religious authority. By local standards, it was a minor offense. But to Father Thornton, it was an opportunity to tighten his hold over the wealthy Ashford family. Within 2 weeks of her confession, Isabella noticed that Father Thornton's sermons began to include veiled warnings about young women corrupting their minds with dangerous ideas. When he requested a private audience with her father to discuss the moral welfare of the parish's youth, Isabella's suspicions solidified. Unlike most, Isabella refused to settle for suspicion alone. Determined to uncover the truth, she drew on the skills honed through years of careful study. She began methodically tracking Father Thornton's patterns, who he called for private meetings, when these meetings occurred, and how they aligned with what she knew of parishioners' confessions. She paid close attention to which families had suddenly begun donating more generously to the church, trying to discern what secrets they might have confessed to inspire such acts of piety. Most importantly, Isabella began testing her suspicions through careful, deliberate experiments. She confessed invented sins to Father Thornton, petty theft from local merchants, improper thoughts about married men, even a fabricated story about secretly reading Protestant religious texts borrowed from Anglican neighbors. Each time, Isabella watched for signs that Father Thornton was exploiting her confessions to manipulate her family. When she claimed she had taken a silk handkerchief from Whitmore's general store, Father Thornton's next sermon denounced those who stole, even in small matters. When she invented a romantic interest in a married tobacco merchant, the priest began counseling her father about finding Isabella a suitable husband before her natural feminine weaknesses led her into temptation. But it was a more daring lie that convinced Isabella something far darker was at play. She told Father Thornton she had overheard her father plotting to evade customs duties by falsely declaring a shipment of European goods as religious materials exempt from taxation. The confession was pure fiction. Her father was known for his honesty, but within days, Father Thornton summoned James Ashford for a private meeting to discuss the spiritual peril of questionable business practices. With mounting horror, Isabella realized Father Thornton was systematically using the sanctity of confession to blackmail his flock. Her investigation soon uncovered something even more chilling. The scheme appeared to reach beyond St. Bartholomew's parish. Quiet inquiries among her connections in Annapolis and Baltimore revealed that other Catholic churches had recently installed elaborate new confessionals. When she mentioned the names Marcus and Samuel Thornton, a pattern emerged, suggesting a coordinated criminal enterprise cloaked in religious authority. Armed with this knowledge, Isabella resolved to do what few colonial women would dare. She decided to confront Father Thornton directly. She requested a private meeting, pretending to seek spiritual counsel about her upcoming engagement to Jonathan Pierce, a young merchant her parents had chosen for her. The meeting was set for a Thursday evening in late February 1737, in Father Thornton's study beside the church sanctuary. He welcomed her with his usual paternal warmth, offering tea and congratulating her on the engagement. But Isabella had not come for pleasantries. "Father Thornton," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to say, "I have reason to believe you have been violating the sacred seal of confession to extort money from your parishioners." His gentle expression did not falter, but Isabella caught a subtle shift in his posture, a faint tensing that told her she had struck home. "My dear child," Father Thornton said softly, "I fear your approaching marriage and its natural anxieties may be troubling your mind. Perhaps we should discuss these concerns in confession, where I can guide you properly." "I have no intention of confessing anything to you," Isabella said firmly. "I want you to explain why your sermons echo the private sins people confess. Why families who admit certain transgressions are then pressed for larger donations. And why your confessionals are built the way they are." At that, Father Thornton's mask of benevolence finally slipped, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. When he spoke again, his voice carried a subtle menace that confirmed Isabella's deepest fears. "Miss Ashford, I fear you've developed some very dangerous ideas that, if spread, could bring great distress to your family. Perhaps it would be wise for you to focus on preparing for your marriage and leave theological matters to those properly trained." Isabella rose to leave, but Father Thornton's final words stopped her at the door. "I trust this conversation will remain between us. Your family enjoys a sterling reputation in this community. It would be tragic if that were to be tarnished by unfounded accusations against a servant of God." As Isabella walked through Havenwood's dark streets, dread tightened around her heart. She had not only confirmed her suspicions about Father Thornton's crimes, she had made herself a target. His words had been a threat, plain and simple: cooperate with his schemes or watch her family's name destroyed. But Isabella Ashford had not spent years buried in philosophy and theology to be silenced by a corrupt priest. She already had a plan, one that would either expose the Thornton network or destroy her utterly. And she was prepared for either outcome if it meant justice. Her plan required resources, allies, and a level of secrecy that would test even her formidable intellect. She had identified the crime, uncovered the method, and confronted one of its architects. Now she needed irrefutable proof strong enough to force the church's hierarchy to act before Father Thornton could strike first. She believed the key lay beneath St. Bartholomew's, in the basement chamber she suspected housed the confession recording system. Years of attending the church had revealed curious details: a locked door in the basement, the unusual acoustics of the nave hinting at hidden spaces, and Father Thornton's habit of vanishing when no services were scheduled. Her chance came in March 1737 during the annual Lenten retreat. With most of the parish in Annapolis for special services, Father Thornton had announced that St. Bartholomew's would be closed for cleaning and repairs, granting Isabella the window she needed to investigate. But first, she had to neutralize the threat to her family. Her solution showed the kind of strategic mind that would have impressed any military commander. She drafted a meticulous letter detailing her suspicions, the suspicious links between confessions and sermons, the confessional's strange construction, and Father Thornton's veiled threats. She made multiple copies, addressed to Bishop Carroll in Baltimore, the governor of Maryland, and her cousin Thomas Ashford, a magistrate in Annapolis. These letters she entrusted to a loyal family servant, with instructions to deliver them at once if anything happened to her, or if she failed to retrieve them by a certain date. This dead man's switch ensured that any harm Father Thornton might inflict would trigger an inquiry that could ruin him. With her family shielded, Isabella set her plan in motion. On the second night of the retreat, using keys borrowed from her friend Margaret Whitmore, the church's volunteer caretaker, Isabella slipped into St. Bartholomew's basement. What she found surpassed her worst fears. Behind the locked door, the hidden chamber beneath the confessional had been transformed into a sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation. The walls were lined with metal tubes that carried sound down from the confessionals above, while an intricate system of curved metal reflectors amplified every whisper into perfect clarity. But the most damning evidence was housed in the rows of wooden cabinets, hundreds of coded documents, transcripts of confessions spanning nearly 3 years, meticulously organized by parish and cross-referenced by the names of the confessors. Isabella spent hours poring over the files, her dread deepening as the true extent of the Thornton network's activities unfolded before her. These records held not just confessions, but detailed profiles of victims, lists of blackmail payments, and secret correspondence between the three Thornton priests as they plotted to expand their operation into parishes across Maryland and Virginia. One folder, marked with symbols Isabella didn't recognize, seemed to list parishioners who had become inconvenient for the network. Her blood turned to ice when she realized that several of these people had died under mysterious circumstances in the past 2 years, deaths officially blamed on natural causes, but the coded notes suggested otherwise. The most chilling discovery was a plan labeled their final solution, a systematic expansion of their blackmail ring until it controlled every Catholic parish in the Chesapeake region, transforming the Thorntons into a criminal power capable of steering the colony's economic and political life. Isabella carefully photographed the most incriminating pages using a camera obscura technique she had mastered through her scientific studies. But as she worked, faint noises from the church above made her breath catch in her throat. Father Thornton had returned early from his retreat. She heard his footsteps moving steadily toward the basement door. She barely managed to snuff out her candle and slip behind a filing cabinet before he entered the chamber. Through a narrow gap, she watched him move with practiced ease, checking the recording tubes and inspecting recent transcripts. Then, to her horror, he unlocked a hidden drawer and withdrew a small glass vial containing a white powder. Isabella's heart pounded as she watched him measure a dose into a separate container before resealing both vials and returning them to their hiding place. Even in the dim glow, Isabella recognized the substance from her studies, arsenic, infamously dubbed inheritance powder for its lethal efficiency. For nearly an hour, Father Thornton reviewed documents and scribbled notes into his coded journal before finally locking the chamber and leaving. Isabella stayed frozen behind the cabinet for another hour before daring to move. She now had proof that the Thorntons were not only extorting confessions but also willing to kill to safeguard their secrets. At dawn, she retrieved her hidden letters from the servant and added pages detailing everything she had witnessed, including the vial of poison. But she faced an agonizing choice: should she gather more evidence to guarantee the Thorntons' conviction, or act immediately to prevent further deaths? The decision was made for her when word arrived that Richard Whitmore had collapsed after receiving communion at Sunday Mass, his symptoms matching arsenic poisoning exactly. As Whitmore lay dying at home, his physician baffled by what he called a sudden, severe fever, Isabella realized the Thorntons had already begun silencing potential threats. She had less than a day to expose the conspiracy before more parishioners joined Whitmore in the grave. But the network had operated undetected for nearly 3 years, and Isabella knew they had contingency plans she was only beginning to uncover. When she awoke the next morning to find 2 strangers stationed across the street, watching her house, she knew her time had run out. On the street, Isabella Ashford realized that her own life was now in immediate danger. The final confrontation between her and the Thornton network would test not only her courage and intelligence, but her willingness to sacrifice everything, even her life, to stop a criminal conspiracy from seizing total control over Colonial Maryland's Catholic community. The morning of March 15, 1737, broke grand bitterly cold over Havenwood. A dense fog drifted in from the Chesapeake Bay, muffling sound and dissolving the line between earth and sky. Isabella stood at her bedroom window, watching the 2 men who had kept vigil outside her house through the night. Their breath curled in the frosty air as they pretended to exchange casual words, though their eyes never left the Ashford residence. Richard Whitmore had died during the night, his final hours racked by the excruciating symptoms of arsenic poisoning, which the local physician, Dr. Benjamin Crawford, had mistakenly diagnosed as putrid fever. Isabella understood at once: Whitmore's death was both a warning and a declaration of war. The Thorntons were willing to kill anyone who threatened their secrets, and she would be next unless she acted now. She had spent a sleepless night preparing for this reckoning. Her plan was bold and desperate: to destroy the Thornton network outright, or expose its crimes so publicly that no assassin's blade could bury the truth. The key lay in their single fatal weakness, their arrogance, and their absolute confidence that a young woman's accusations would never be believed over the word of esteemed priests. At 8 o'clock that morning, Isabella stepped calmly out of her house and walked straight toward the two men. Her audacity caught them off guard, buying her the precious seconds she needed. "Please inform Father Thornton that Miss Ashford requests an immediate meeting to discuss her recent spiritual concerns," she said clearly, loud enough for several neighbors to overhear as they began their morning routines. "Tell him I have documents that will greatly interest him, and I'm prepared to discuss terms for their return." The men exchanged uneasy glances. After a hurried whisper between them, one turned and headed towards St. Bartholomew's, while the other resumed his watch on Isabella. Father Thornton's reply arrived within the hour. He would see her at 2 o'clock that afternoon, in the church sanctuary, under the pretext of offering spiritual counsel for her grief over Richard Whitmore's death. The choice of location suited Isabella perfectly. The sanctuary's acoustics would carry every word to the witnesses she had carefully placed throughout the church. Among them were her cousin, Thomas Ashford, a magistrate from Annapolis who had rushed to Havenwood at her urgent summons, Dr. Benjamin Crawford, still troubled by the strange symptoms he had seen in Whitmore, and Margaret Whitmore, who, despite her sorrow, agreed to help Isabella, convinced her husband's death was tied to the mysterious payments he had been making to the church each month. Most critical of all, however, was Bishop Carroll himself. Alarmed by Isabella's detailed letter, the bishop had traveled from Baltimore to investigate personally. Skeptical at first, he had found her evidence compelling enough to demand answers in person. At exactly 2 o'clock, Isabella entered St. Bartholomew's sanctuary. Father Thornton waited for her at the altar, but his usual kindly mask had fallen away, replaced by an expression cold and predatory. The afternoon light streamed through the church's plain windows, casting long shadows across the pews and creating an atmosphere more suited to a trial than a spiritual counseling session. "Miss Ashford," Father Thornton began, his voice echoing through the empty sanctuary, "I understand you have some concerns about certain church matters you'd like to discuss." "Indeed I do, Father," Isabella replied, positioning herself so her voice would carry to the hidden witnesses. "I've discovered that you and your nephews are running a criminal conspiracy, one that violates the sacred seal of confession and uses religious authority to commit extortion and murder." Father Thornton's mask of priestly concern slipped away, revealing the calculating criminal beneath. "Those are very serious accusations, Miss Ashford. I hope you have substantial evidence to back them up." "I do," Isabella said, producing a folder. "I have transcripts of confessions you recorded in your basement chamber. I have coded correspondence between you and your nephews, detailing blackmail payments and the expansion of your network to 16 more parishes. And I witnessed you handling arsenic in the same basement, where Richard Whitmore's confession was recorded. The same Richard Whitmore who died last night, showing clear symptoms of arsenic poisoning." Father Thornton's eyes narrowed as he realized the extent of her knowledge. "Miss Ashford, you've stumbled into matters far beyond your understanding. The work we do serves a higher purpose than your simple mind can grasp." "Then enlighten me, Father," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the danger. "Explain how blackmailing parishioners and poisoning anyone who might expose you serves God's purpose." Father Thornton stepped closer, his imposing height casting a deeper shadow over her. "The Catholic Church in Maryland exists at the mercy of Protestant authorities who would see us destroyed at the first chance. We have built a system that ensures our survival and prosperity by securing the loyalty of our most influential flock. Those who contribute generously receive our protection. Those who threaten our mission face the consequences of betrayal." "You mean those who refuse to pay your extortion demands are murdered," Isabella said bluntly. "I mean that God works through his servants in mysterious ways," Father Thornton replied. Richard Whitmore had become unreliable, asking questions, demanding to know how his charitable contributions were spent. He threatened the entire operation. A chill ran through Isabella as she realized he was all but confessing to murder, confident she wouldn't live to repeat it. But what he didn't know was that every word was being heard by Bishop Carroll and the other witnesses hidden throughout the sanctuary. "And what about me, Father?" Isabella asked. "Am I also a threat to your operation?" Father Thornton's smile was chilling. "Miss Ashford, you are an unmarried young woman making hysterical accusations against respected priests. Even if you spoke publicly, who would believe you? They'd dismiss it as the fantasies of a disturbed mind. But fortunately for both of us, it won't come to that." "Because you intend to kill me too?" "Because you're going to withdraw these ridiculous accusations voluntarily, and destroy whatever so-called evidence you think you have." Father Thornton leaned forward, his voice low and deceptively gentle. "You see, my dear, we know all about your midnight visit to our basement. We know you violated the sanctity of God's house to steal church records. More importantly, we have witnesses prepared to testify they saw you at Richard Whitmore's home the night he died. And we have proof that you possessed arsenic for your chemical experiments." Isabella felt the trap tighten around her, the air thick with the cunning of the Thornton family's contingency plans. They had anticipated every possibility, prepared to sacrifice her to protect themselves, ready to brand her a murderer to conceal their own corruption. Father Thornton's eyes glimmered with mock pity as he continued. "Even if you somehow escaped a murder charge, the scandal alone would ruin your family. Your father's business partners would vanish overnight. Your engagement to Jonathan Pierce, ended. Your family, ostracized from decent society. But all this can be avoided, Isabella, if you simply admit your accusations were nothing more than a woman's hysteria. Grief-stricken delusions after poor Whitmore's death." "And if I refuse?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling only slightly. A shadow of false sorrow crossed Father Thornton's face, as if he lamented the words he spoke next. "Then I'm afraid you'll be discovered in your room tomorrow morning, having taken your own life, overcome by remorse for falsely accusing innocent priests and for murdering Richard Whitmore. Suicide is a mortal sin, of course. But God is merciful to those driven to madness by their own wickedness." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. This was the final test, not only of her courage but of her faith in truth, her willingness to risk everything to end the evil festering behind the church's walls. Thornton had shown her the depth of his corruption, certain she would not live to expose it. But he had miscalculated. "You've made one critical mistake, Father Thornton," Isabella said, her voice ringing clear and strong through the darkened sanctuary. "You assumed I came here alone, and unprepared." For the first time, Thornton's mask of certainty slipped. He flinched as Isabella raised her voice to the shadows. "Bishop Carroll, Magistrate Ashford, Dr. Crawford, I trust you've heard enough to understand the conspiracy we face." Color drained from Thornton's face as Bishop Carroll stepped into the light from behind the altar, followed by Magistrate Ashford and Dr. Crawford. The priest's eyes darted to the sanctuary doors, only to see Ashford's armed men blocking every exit. "Thomas Thornton," Bishop Carroll intoned, voice heavy with grief and authority, "by the power vested in me by the Holy Catholic Church, I strip you of your priesthood and excommunicate you for your crimes against the faithful. Magistrate Ashford, this man is yours." But Thornton's surrender was an illusion. As Ashford stepped forward with iron shackles, the disgraced priest lunged for a cabinet near the altar. Isabella realized too late that a weapon had been hidden there all along. The final seconds seemed to stretch into eternity. The glint of a blade, Ashford's pistol drawn, Isabella's breath caught, then the deafening crack of a gunshot tore through St. Bartholomew's sanctuary. Silence fell like a shroud. Isabella could hear her own heartbeat echo off the stone walls. Father Thornton lay sprawled before the altar, the knife glinting beside his lifeless hand. Ashford lowered his smoking pistol, eyes dark with resolve. "He chose his own judgment," he said quietly. "God help his soul." In the days that followed, the investigation unveiled the true scope of Thornton's corruption. Ashford's men uncovered secret chambers beneath St. Bartholomew's, St. Michael's, and St. Joseph's, each filled with coded ledgers and blackmail files. For nearly 4 years, The Thornton network had exploited the sacred trust of confession, extorting hundreds of victims and amassing secrets on over 2,000 families across Maryland. Their reach had been vast, their cruelty insidious, but now their web lay exposed to the light. And Isabella, who had faced the darkness and refused to yield, had ensured their victims would finally know justice. The scope of their operation extended far beyond simple blackmail. It encompassed systematic tax evasion, customs fraud, and at least 7 murders staged to look like natural deaths. Marcus and Samuel Thornton were arrested at their respective parishes while attempting to destroy evidence of their involvement. Both men initially pleaded ignorance of their uncle's crimes, claiming they believed they were engaged in legitimate church intelligence work meant to better serve their parishioners' spiritual needs. However, the coded correspondence recovered from their churches told a far different story. These documents revealed that the Thorntons had actively planned blackmail schemes and were fully aware of the murders carried out to protect the network. Their trials became a public spectacle across Colonial Maryland, attracting crowds from as far as Philadelphia and Charleston. Court proceedings laid bare not only the mechanics of the extortion ring but also its deep reach into colonial society. Victim testimony showed that the Thorntons systematically targeted the wealthiest and most influential Catholic families in the region, exploiting confessions to manipulate business deals and political appointments alike. Dr. Benjamin Crawford's testimony proved especially damning. He revealed that, over the previous 2 years, he had treated 4 other patients who exhibited symptoms identical to those of Richard Whitmore's fatal illness. Each had been a regular church donor and each had died after a period of unusual anxiety about their spiritual state. Exhumations confirmed the worst. All 4 bodies contained lethal levels of arsenic, proving they had been systematically poisoned. The psychological toll on Maryland's Catholic community was devastating. The revelation that 3 priests had broken the sacred seal of confession to extort and murder parishioners shattered the trust that bound the faithful together. Many families abandoned Mass altogether, while others demanded that Bishop Carroll introduce safeguards to prevent such abuses of religious power. The economic fallout was equally severe. Over 4 years, the Thorntons' blackmail network had amassed an estimated £12,000, a fortune by colonial standards, invested in property and ventures throughout the Chesapeake region. The legal effort to recover and redistribute these illicit gains would drag on for nearly a decade after the trials ended. Isabella Ashford, whose brave actions exposed the conspiracy, became both a celebrated and controversial figure. Many praised her courage and keen mind, while others condemned her for violating church property and questioned whether a young woman should have involved herself in such dangerous affairs. The debate over Isabella's role reflected deeper tensions in colonial society over women's responsibilities and the limits of religious authority. The long-term consequences of the Thornton affair rippled far beyond Maryland's Catholic community. The scandal fueled Protestant suspicions about Catholic loyalty and gave ammunition to those who argued Catholics could not be trusted in positions of power. These divisions lingered into the Revolutionary era and beyond, shaping debates on religious freedom and the separation of church and state. In response, Bishop Carroll enacted sweeping reforms, mandatory inspections of all church construction projects, regular rotation of priests between parishes, and stricter oversight of church finances, all designed to prevent such betrayals from ever happening again. But the deeper question of how to prevent the abuse of religious authority while still preserving the vital work of pastoral care remained unanswered. The physical alterations the Thorntons made to their churches were torn down, yet the buildings themselves continued to stand, grim reminders of the corruption that once festered within their walls. St. Bartholomew's Church remained a cornerstone of the Havenwood community, though many parishioners confessed to feeling uneasy during confession for years after the scandal broke. Marcus Thornton was executed in the spring of 1738, convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and multiple counts of extortion. His brother, Samuel Thornton, received a life sentence, given his younger age and seemingly lesser role in the murder's planning. Yet Samuel died in prison less than 2 years later under circumstances that many found suspicious. The wider implications of the Thornton conspiracy echoed through colonial American society for decades. The case became a landmark in debates over religious freedom, clerical accountability, and the proper boundary between church and state. Legal scholars cited the Thornton precedent when arguing about the limits of religious privilege and when secular authorities must intervene in church affairs. Isabella Ashford did marry Jonathan Pierce as planned, though their wedding was delayed nearly a year as the trials dragged on and their aftermath settled. She never spoke publicly about her role in exposing the conspiracy, but private letters discovered after her death in 1782 revealed the lasting toll it took on her. In one letter to her cousin, written in 1745, she wrote, "Sometimes I wonder if the truth was worth the lives it cost and the faith it destroyed. But then I remember Richard Whitmore's final agony, and I know that some evils must be faced, no matter the price." The story of the Thornton family's criminal conspiracy reminds us that corruption can flourish even within institutions society holds most sacred, and that the price of justice often falls hardest on those brave enough to speak truth to power. In the tobacco fields of Colonial Maryland, beneath the shadow of St. Bartholomew's Bell Tower, the legacy of that courage endures, a testament that no authority, religious or secular, is beyond accountability when it betrays the trust of those it claims to serve. Yet perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Thornton affair is not what was uncovered but what remains hidden. The coded documents found in the churches hinted at other networks operating in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas, suggesting that the Maryland conspiracy may have been only one part of a far larger criminal web that stretched across colonial America. Despite extensive investigations, these other networks were never exposed, leaving historians to wonder how many secrets still lie buried beneath the foundations of the country's oldest churches. The final entry in Father Thomas Thornton's encrypted journal, discovered months after his death when investigators finally cracked his cipher, contained a single, unsettling line. "The harvest is vast but the workers are few. Others will continue what we have begun." Whether this was the desperate boast of a dying criminal or a clue to accomplices who escaped justice remains one of colonial America's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. What do you think? Was everything truly brought to light, or do secrets still linger beneath America's oldest churches? Leave your thoughts below and share what you believe about the Thornton conspiracy. If you enjoyed this dark tale from colonial America and want more stories that reveal the hidden horrors of our nation's past, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves historical mysteries. The shadows of the past hold many secrets, and we're just getting started uncovering them. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another forgotten horror that time tried to bury.